I want to share a poem with you. It is a poem that gives voice to many of the feelings that have been coming up for me as I have been watching the footage in Minneapolis and other places about the way that this administration has been targeting vulnerable citizens, the cold-blooded shootings of Renee Good and Alex Preddy by Gestapo-like henchmen who beat up not only people but also the Constitution, as well as principles of democracy and due process. The poem I'd like to read is by Lynn Unger, who you also know was a minister who served here. I've been reading a lot of her poems lately, and one of the reasons is that she just put a link to 40 of her poems on Facebook for free, an unusual thing for a professional poet. Like many of us, she was feeling helpless and wanted to do something for the people of Minneapolis, but didn't know what she, as a writer, could do. So she posted the free poems with the simple request that in lieu of payment to her, people could make a donation to one of the agencies in Minneapolis who are helping to care for the people targeted by ICE. If anyone needs help finding her link or good agencies to support, then please see me after the service. This poem is called Bullies. Might as well admit it, the bullies are running the school. No teacher, no parent, no principal is stepping in. They will take what they can, add it to their hoard, and toss some bright coin of power to the henchmen who roam the halls. I wish I knew how to make it safe. I wish I knew how to send us all back to science or language or music or math or whatever it was that we came here to do. I wish. The bullies will not be satisfied because brutality does not satisfy. They have set the terms of a game no one can win. It may come down to the need to hide. But don't hide out alone. We are gathering in the library behind the science fiction stacks. We are holed up in the art room with our colored pens. And we are yelling in soundproofed practice music rooms. We have brought our instruments to the band. We have brought our voices to the choir. We still have words to print in the bulletin and the yearbook, and in the poetry chapbook we expect no one to read. We are plotting behind the bleachers, and we are still determined to put on the play. We probably won't catch the conscience of the king who is utterly without shame, but we have come together to learn our lines, to sing our songs, to live the lives the bullies cannot imagine. Well, when authoritarian forces are throwing dirt on democracy, then singing joyfully is an act of resistance. Yes. Like many of you, I have been struggling with what's going on in the world. And perhaps, like many of you, I've been struggling with what's been going on inside of me because of what's going on in the world. A look at the bullying and belligerence, the violence and the shootings, and a number of feelings emerge for me. Fear, anger, And then I see what appears to be apathy, a paralysis from Congress and other authorities that people look up to, which seems to condone the current status quo. And it becomes clear that what Lynn Unger describes is true. The bullies are running the school. No teacher, no parents, no principal is stepping in. And that's when I notice one of the biggest feelings that comes to me and really bothers me, and that is cynicism. Today I want to talk to you about the theme of this month, which is resilience, and share about my own struggle and the struggle of the world to move beyond the fear and the anger and the cynicism, keeping us stuck in survival brain. And to acknowledge that while we get thrown to the ground by an insurgence of emotions that come up in us, thousands of others are being thrown to the ground by an insurgence more physical in nature. And as we watch people being shot at and dragged away, we can't help but hear their call for others, those with enough emotional resilience to show up and bear witness. To help me explore what gets in the way of emotional resilience, I want to begin with a story about Jamil Zaki, a professor of psychology at Stanford University and director of the Stanford Social Neuroscience Lab. For years, he studied what he called empathy science and the power of things like compassion and kindness and cooperation and community. His research was so well known, he got the nickname Guy Smiley. But a little over a year ago, he came out with a book on a slightly adjacent topic. It was called Hope for Cynics: The Surprising Science of Human Goodness. And in this book, he offered a personal confession that surprised many of his colleagues. Guy Smiley is a recovering cynic. Turns out that for most of his life, even while carrying out research on human goodness, Jamil Zaki was a closeted cynic. He was filled with doubts. He instantly saw the worst side of people and situations. He was often anxious and neurotic and pessimistic. But when the people from TED, the Global Conference of Inspiring Speakers, came across his work and called him, wanting to have him give a talk on optimism as a path for social change, he got excited. So excited, in fact, that he immediately, right then and there, began drafting an outline of his talk, listing the research he was going to cite, the anecdotes he was going to tell, all the best ways to convince people that optimism bends the moral arc of the universe toward justice. He remembers that day very clearly, because it was the first Wednesday of the new year, January 6th, 2021. Halfway through his outline, a friend texted telling him to turn on the television. When he did, he saw what the rest of the world saw: an insurrection at our nation's capital. And his immediate thought was to question himself. Am I completely full of it? He wondered. Is everything I've dedicated my life to, everything I talk about, really just a lie? It's not a lie. In the words of Brian Stevenson, none of us are the worst things we have ever done. And thank God none of us are the worst things we have ever thought either, for all of us have likely lived through the terror and despair that has prompted us to think some pretty mean things, both about others and about ourselves. I won't go into why our first impulse in such a moment of despair is to revoke all of the faith we have in ourselves, except for, to quote poet Ruth Gendler, who you might remember came to speak to us last year about her book of qualities. In that book of qualities, she describes despair like this. Despair is not lying or exaggerating. Still, it is difficult to be around her. There is no arguing with her. Despair is pervasive and persuasive, eloquent and undeniably well-informed. If you attempt to change her mind, you will come away agreeing with her. In her dreams, the war is everywhere. The seed of despair was planted in me early. I remember as early as kindergarten noticing pint-sized ice wannabes practicing intimidation tactics like it was an honors program in the school curriculum. What's happening in Minneapolis, people learning to stand up for themselves against grown-up playground bullies, is simply a courageous response to a highly organized and well-funded version of my kindergarten experience. And those people who are standing up are literally dodging bullets. Growing up in Los Angeles, few of the bullets we dodged were the literal kind, lead shot from a loaded gun. Mostly what we dodged were the metaphorical kind, taunting and shaming, people intimidating and humiliating more vulnerable classmates to gain some sort of leverage and establish their place in the hierarchy. It didn't take much to qualify as a target, just some noticeable difference. At the community pool, it was revealed I had an Audi. And no, I am not talking about the car. And if you became a target, you were subject to things like being slapped in the back of the head when the mean kids walked past your desk, or you were pressured to give out answers to the upcoming test, or you had a glove stolen at practice, or you were told you were going to hell for being a Unitarian. I learned later that it's hurt people who hurt people. Boys, mostly, passing cruelty on to others who can't defend themselves, just like bullies couldn't defend themselves when it was passed on to them. Does anybody remember the game Pass It On? It was a game in school that you played while you lined up for class. Someone jabbed an elbow into the ribs of the person in front of them, and when they turned around to retaliate, the person just said, "Not me, it's a game, pass it on." The victim, getting the joke, would proceed to play, jabbing the kid in front of him, and no one seemed to mind as long as they could pass it on. It's a toxic system. A parent nags a child who hits his sister, who yells at the dog, who growls at the cat, who chases mice. But it's the very pattern of behavior that is responsible for the cascade of violence, producing everything from ICE recruits to ruthless dictators, depending mostly on how much privilege we start with. It's a chain reaction of hurt. Lessons in dodging bullets instruct us to lay low, practice the art of self-protection. But you know what else it teaches? How to be a repository for anger and cynicism, how to absorb it and live with it. What it doesn't teach is how to let it go, how to reclaim our better self and rebuild a better society. In his book, Dr. Zaki makes it clear that cynicism, with its precursors of intimidation and anger, and with the multiplier of living in a system indifferent to our survival, was a curriculum of evolution long before Minneapolis or LA public school system was even a glimmer in the eye of our ancestors. The human brain is pre-wired with defaults that tip us toward cynicism. Evolutionary psychologists talk about negativity bias, the idea that it's often easier to focus on negative events in people than positive events in people. We are predisposed to remember near tragedies that kept us alive amidst recurring trauma when few guidance counselors are around to step in. What's more, Dr. Zaki points out that there is a mountain of research that shows tremendous social reinforcement for cynicism. A majority of people today are likely to tell you that adopting a cynical perspective is a form of social wisdom. Many cynics reject the label and call themselves realists. Dr. Zaki notes that one thing many of these realists have in common, besides, quote, hostility and a little bit of contempt, unquote, is a sort of bitter pride. They will say that if you don't think in cynical terms, then you're just naive. You're a rube or a chump. That if you pay close enough attention, you'll eventually realize the cynical perspective is actually the right one. Indeed, multiple surveys have found that 70% of the general population believe that cynics are smarter than non-cynics. And 85% of people think that cynics are better at picking out liars than non-cynics. So it's easy to see why cynics as a species have prevailed, even thrived. The problem is, none of that is true. Data from tons of national surveys with hundreds of thousands of participants found that cynics actually perform less well on cognitive tests than non-cynics, and that cynics are worse at spotting liars than non-cynics. So it's important to know the perception of cynicism as a type of intelligence is clearly at odds with the data. What's more, cynics test on a variety of physical markers to be far less healthy. They show greater signs of cellular aging and inflammation. They are more prone to heart disease, and they have shorter life expectancies. One of the reasons for this, Dr. Zaki surmises, is that cynical people have a harder time tapping into one of the key things that soothes dysregulated people, which is connection to themselves and connection to other people. Without those, cynicism tends to sink down deeper into our character. But one of the things that jumped out to me in Dr. Zaki's work is the idea that cynicism seems to be kryptonite for trust. Trust of other people, trust of society, trust of our ability to come together, and trust in ourselves to be okay. There's a story from my earliest days in ministries that I think illuminates this point. My first ministry was in a small congregation in the suburbs of Atlanta. After my first couple years, we began taking our first steps to becoming a welcoming congregation, allies to gays and lesbians. And then a member of the congregation asked our board if his son's Cub Scout troop could meet in our basement. You may remember that in the early 2000s, the Boy Scouts of America, the parent organization of Cub Scouts, had policies excluding all but heterosexual boys. Scouting America has since changed their policies, but at the time they were quite adamant, and there were no other options. This led the BSA to be an early example of cancel culture among liberals, including UUs. At the same board meeting that this was proposed, I spoke and I lamented the policy, saying that the BSA policy excluding gays or lesbians was based on ignorance and hate. But I was in favor of having them use our space. If they believe we're morally questionable and unsafe, what better way to prove that we're actually kind and ethical and supportive of children's well-being? We have to be in proximity to change anyone's perception of us. They'll come, they'll see our beliefs posted on the wall, but it will be our presence that changes hearts and minds. We might not change the minds of Scouts International, but we might change the minds of this one troop. This all led to a pretty heated debate which soon dominated conversation in the congregation, at least long enough for the member to withdraw his request. In the newsletter that followed, the president of the congregation thanked the member for withdrawing the request that could divide us. In the same article, the Committee on Ministry likened the episode to dodging a bullet. Cynicism becomes a refuge for anyone with a vow of never again. In part, our refusal to re-enter an old struggle is to honor the distance that we managed to create between our current life and that old pain. But another piece may be that we don't trust ourselves to have learned what we need to know to grow into a more capable version of ourselves. Cynicism is a theory concluding a negative outcome. Cynics see injustice just like the rest of us do, but convince themselves that nothing can be done. They think that if a broken system is the result of a more pervasive broken nature, then any attempt to make a difference is doomed from the outset. That's why Dr. Zaki says statistics show that cynical people are less likely to take part in social movements. They're less likely to vote. They're more willing to do things like spread conspiracy theories. In fact, he suggests that autocrats and authoritarians benefit from cynicism. They actually cultivate and use it as a way of promoting the status quo. After all, a population that doesn't trust itself as agents of change is an easy one to manipulate. So the question becomes, without cynicism to protect us, how can we face the brutality we know is out there and still protect ourselves and the people we love? 60 years ago, this same question was raised by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. when he asked, how then can we stop the vicious cycle of hurt begetting hurt and hate begetting hate? Inspired by the teachings of Jesus and Gandhi, King proclaimed that the way to overcome intentional animosity and evil is with what he called, quote, a strength to love. A love willing to return brute force with soul force. A truth about ourselves so formidable that it's willing to absorb the hurt and hate and not hurt back. To face the pain of the world in all the well-funded and malicious forms it takes today, we must learn to recognize that returning to the scene of the crime is not forcing us to re-inhabit that part of us that was broken by the experience. In the words of trauma-informed counselor Reverend Sherry Heller, revisiting past trauma is not a recipe for keeping us who we were. It's, quote, an invitation into becoming someone we've never allowed ourselves to be. It is the reclamation of self after a lifetime of distortion, silence, and survival. This path is neither easy nor linear. It requires grieving identities that once kept us safe, shedding roles that no longer fit, and stepping into the uncharted territory of authenticity. Post-traumatic growth is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a life lived in truth, end quote. The path forward is not a foolhardy renunciation of the bulletproof cynicism we thought would save us. Instead, Professor Zaki recommends a shift into what he calls hopeful skepticism. Cynicism, he says, is a theory that things will turn out poorly. And all theories are subject to confirmation bias, a way of seeing the world that proves that our theory is true. But hopeful skepticism requires proof. But it starts with the assumption that a good outcome is possible. It asks us to construct a mindset of our highest values, not our worst fears, and spot evidence where building a foundation for such values is possible. Zaki admits that he's often confronted by people thinking that what he's saying is wanting them to put on rose-colored glasses. No, he contends, it's likely you're already wearing glasses, but they're covered in mud. Just take those off. Don't pay less attention to what's impossible. Learn to pay better attention to what is possible. In so doing, we might discover a resilience we never dared to know, a new breath of possibility, and more company to share it with. So let me close with another poem from Lynn Unger called Breathe. Breathe, said the wind. How can I breathe at a time like this, when the air is full of smoke, of burning tires and burning lives? Just breathe, the wind insisted. Well, that's easy for you to say if the weight of injustice is not wrapped around your throat, cutting off all air. I need you to breathe. I need you to breathe. Don't tell me to be calm when there's so many reasons to be angry, so much cause for despair. I didn't say to be calm, said the wind. I said to breathe. We are going to need a lot of air to make this hurricane together. So may it be for us that we may find ourselves and one another together, summoning a soul force powerful enough to counter brute force. Amen. Blessed be.